Alright, so this is the third video in the series in which we're going to talk about shoot mode. So in the previous video I kind of set up a very basic scene, and since then I basically decided that it wasn't very interesting, so I adjusted some of the lighting, added some volumetric clouds, and now we have something a little more interesting. In the future, as I keep mentioning, we're going to go over the lighting and the visual settings in a future video, but for now let's talk about how to deal with cameras in the scene. So you can add cameras to your scene by going to Create, Cameras, and then choosing one of three types. We have free cameras, which is kind of like the free floating one that we have already here. We can add a tripod camera, or we can add a crane camera. Now, tripod cameras and crane cameras are really meant more for visualizing what your set is going to look like, right? So you kind of know where I'm going to put the crane, where I'm going to put the tripod, and they do work. You can view them in shoot mode, but they're not as accurate and easy to work with as just a free-floating camera. So when you're working with general virtual production stuff and just kind of getting a sense of what your shot's going to look like, I recommend sticking with the free-floating camera. That being said, the crane camera and the tripod do have some interesting advantages, such as being able to adjust them somewhat realistically. But it's really meant to be an approximation of the way those things work in real life. That being said, with this video, we're going to work with just a free-floating camera. Also important to note that when we talk about the tracked virtual camera, that only works with free cameras because, let's face it, a floating giant crane is not going to make much sense. So you'll see that the properties panel for cameras are very bare bones, but you can see we can set the aperture, focus distance, focal length, and exposure. Now, I'm not going to mess with these here because we have much more extensive controls in shoot mode, as we'll get to in a second. But an important thing you can do is change the sensor type. Now, this basically changes the relationship between the focal length and the camera's body. It does not affect the aspect ratio as it would on a real camera, because that's something you can set in the shoot mode viewfinder settings. But for this example, I'm going to put it onto a 16mm preset. And now with this camera active, I can go to shoot mode, and here now we view what the camera is seeing. So this is the main viewfinder, where you can actually control your camera. And the way I'm doing that is by just clicking and dragging the left mouse button, and it will change the way the camera is looking. And while that's being held down, you can use the same controls as you would in shoot mode, in stage mode, sorry. So you can use W, A, S, and D to move forward, back, left, right, as well as Q and E to move up and down. So it's kind of like a first-person shooter type camera, albeit much slower and smoother. At the top here we have the four main properties of the camera. We have aperture, focus distance, focal length, and exposure. Now these settings are constantly being improved upon to make the virtual cameras more and more like a real physical camera, but for now, for the previs side of things, they work pretty well. So you'll notice that there's a little keyframe icon next to aperture, focus distance, and focal length. That's because in the future when we talk about the timeline, these are properties that can actually be animated on the timeline. Now what each thing does basically affects the way the camera looks. You know, focal length is zoom. Focus distance is the distance that the target or the subject of focus is in. And the aperture, in a real camera, it would affect the exposure of the shot, but in this virtual camera, it only affects the focus. Essentially determines how big the focal plane is. The reason why we are not doing exposure with aperture is just so we can get a better sense of what's in focus and what's not, which is sometimes difficult to do in a virtual camera. So you can adjust the brightness of your scene either through the exposure or just by adjusting the scene time of day and other visuals like that. So to adjust the focus distance, or I suppose any of these properties, all you have to do is move your mouse over them. You'll see there's a little outline that appears, and you use your scroll wheel to adjust the value. Now, focus distance is just a good example because it's very visual. You can see the difference and the change it makes. So if I scroll up and down, you can see the focus changing. If I go all the way down to 0, it actually switches to an autofocus. So it automatically puts whatever's in the center of the frame in focus. So if I move out of the way, you'll see now it's out of focus and the background is in focus. But if I move over, now you'll see this is in focus and the background is out of focus. It works pretty well, but sometimes you want more fine control, and that's why you can adjust it manually. Also, if there's an object you want to be in focus, you can right-click on it, and it will automatically set the focus distance to that object. Sometimes you do still need to manually adjust it, but it works pretty well. So you can see by clicking at different parts of the scene, I can set the focus distance. Also, if you hold Shift and then right click, it'll lock the focus distance onto that object, so no matter where I move the camera, the focus distance will change, as you can see, to always keep it so this, or the center of this object, is in frame. And that gets broken if you click anywhere else, or adjust it manually. Focal length is zoom, and exposure is the exposure of the shot. This is in EV units, which is something that there's more information on in the documentation, but it basically just controls the exposure of the shot in a way that is found on most like regular handheld cameras. It's technically called exposure compensation, depending on who you're talking to and where you look. So this is the main viewfinder. At the bottom, you'll see a recording button, a toggle for turning on and off the grid, the current timestamp, as well as a capture button. On the right, we have the viewfinder options, and here you have a bunch of different settings that will adjust the way your shot looks, as well as the properties of the recording. So from top to bottom, we have the render camera view button. Now this is essentially the export window, and this is how you get content from SceneForge out into MP4 files or VP8, WebM, whatever it is, as well as individual frame exports. I'm going to talk about this in its own video in the future. Next, we have the chroma key settings, which is not currently available in the public release, so this is kind of a sneak peek, and because of that, it's going to get its own video as well. So next, we can set the aspect ratio. Again, this, in a real film back, the aspect ratio would directly correlate to the sensor size, but in this case, so we have a little more customization, the sensor size affects the focal length and as well as focus, and aspect ratio just kind of changes the shape of the shot. So we have a bunch of these options that are based on just standard aspect ratios in the movie industry. I'm going to leave it at 16:9 just because that's the most standard. We have a couple other options. We have record real-time video. That basically determines if when you press record, it records a video file or if it records the camera's motion. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. We have spout output. Now this is pretty cool because it basically takes the current camera view and outputs it to the spout protocol. Now that is a system for Windows only that allows you to take content from one piece of software and output it to basically any other. So for example, if I turn this on, I'm currently recording this in OBS, and if I enable my spout capture input, you can see I have this little window that I'm controlling in OBS. Now this window is essentially a live feed from software A, which is SceneForge, to software B, which is OBS. So it's useful for streaming to other devices if you like, or capturing it this way. It's up to you. I'm going to close this. Alright. Next, we have the option to play timeline on record. That is exactly what it sounds like if you want to play all the animations in the scene when you click record. Next, we have two expandable sections. We have the mobile camera tracking section. Again, this is going to get its own video, but so you kind of know where it is, it's over here. And then we have the lens options section. Now, these are a bunch of different properties that enhance the realism of the scene. And by realism, I don't mean the way it looks, but I mean the way the virtual camera lens is similar to a physical camera lens. Again, these are things that are constantly being improved upon to make them more and more realistically and closely match your real cameras. From top down, just so you kind of see what each thing does, we have motion blur, which if I turn all the way up, you can see blurs it when you're moving. This is something that's usually, or almost always, directly impacted by the shutter speed of your camera. We have sensor noise. This is kind of like a film grain. You can see we have a bunch of different options to adjust it. We have vignette strength. This is kind of like a darker haze around the edges. It's actually very subtle right now, but I'm probably going to increase the maximum value. Barrel distortion, which is kind of silly, and Petzval distortion, which is kind of like the opposite. These are two things that just kind of generally occur with almost all camera lenses at different intensities depending on the lens. It's just a property of the way they work. And those are those options. So to record and capture content with shoot mode, let's start with capturing still images. So if I press this button, it'll capture a frame in 720p, and that gets saved to your project folder. Now, in addition to saving the actual image, it will capture all of the content of the camera's current data, if that makes sense. So what it's basically doing is remembering the current frame as well as all of this information of your camera when this shot was taken. If I take another one, I press the button and I click the little pop-up, you can see here's the image opened in my Windows photo browser. And for recording, it is a little bit different. Rather than recording the actual video feed to a video file, it is recording the camera's motion to the timeline. So you can see what's actually happening here. If I click record, I'm going to move the camera around. So this is not very interesting, but it's some camera motion. And then I click stop recording. You'll see that we have this little clip on the timeline that appeared here. Now again, timeline stuff is not going to be talked about in this video much, but just so you see what happens when we are recording content. So now if I click play, it'll play back our motion. And in order to get this video out of SceneForge, you would use the render window. But if you wanted to be recording the video in real time while you're recording the motion, you can turn on this toggle. I wouldn't recommend it just because it records to 720p maximum, and it has the potential to significantly slow down the SceneForge editor. So generally, I would record the camera's motion either by manually moving it or by using the motion tracking virtual camera app, and then just rendering it out this way at whatever resolution you want and whatever frame rate you want. So that's the basics of shoot mode. That's kind of just the way it works. A cool thing that is incredibly helpful is that if you go to stage mode and you select the active camera, you can open up this little viewfinder window, and this window, which is, you can move it, resize it, do whatever you want, and this will show what that camera is currently seeing. So it makes it really easy to frame up shots a little bit easier. So I can raise this. I can edit my scene basically knowing what the camera is going to see when we go into shoot mode. So it's really useful. And the camera's properties can also be edited this way using these sliders as well. So you might be wondering, why do we use this capture button as opposed to lining up the shot and then going to the render menu? Well, because content captured with this white little button makes the still images directly accessible in storyboard mode, which is going to be the topic of the next video. Thank you very much.